Hello, and welcome to the ISM New Jersey webinar series, including all of our ISM chapter partners who are joining us today. I'm Kathy Perna, Executive Director at ISM New Jersey. We will be recording today's program, and I will be sending out the link in a follow-up email later today with your continuing educational credit. If you should have any questions, please be sure to use the chat or the Q&A button. We will take the questions or more or less answer the questions towards the end of the presentation. And we do encourage you to ask questions for our speaker. Now on to today's presentation. Our speaker today is Dr. Michael Urick, who will be speaking on leading through conflict in a multi-generational workplace. Very important topic. And thank you for bringing this to our group today. Dr. Urick is a graduate director of the Master of Science in Management Operational Excellence Program and Associate Professor of Management and Operational Excellence at the Alex G. McKenna School of Business, Economics, and Government at Saint Vincent College. He has a PhD, MBA, and teaches undergraduate and graduate courses related to organizational behavior, human resources, communication, and conflict, organizational culture, operations, and research methods. He is an associate editor of the Journal of Leadership and Management and the North American associate editor of the Measuring Business Excellence Journal. He is also the editor of the Exploring Effective Leadership Practices Through Popular Culture book series. He's also a former president of ISM Pittsburgh. And I'd like to turn the program over to Dr. Urick.
Thanks, Kathy. I appreciate it. Yeah, as Kathy mentioned, I've been involved with ISM for a little bit of time. I've been involved with ISM Pittsburgh for a number of years, both on their board and as a member. And recently, I guess it was about 5 years ago, I was president of ISM Pittsburgh. And this in 2 months, in May, I'll be presenting at the national conference in Orlando. Actually, a topic very similar to this. So if you're going to that conference, some of what I'm going to say here today is actually going to be pretty similar to what I'm going to be presenting on the national conference in May in Orlando. That'll be, I think, my third or fourth time presenting at the national conference. So I've had a decent history with ISM over the years. So I'm glad to be here with you today with ISM New Jersey. And again, Kathy and ISM New Jersey, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Before we get started, I just want to mention a couple of things. Again, as Kathy said, please do ask some questions. We'll be looking through those, and we'll take the questions at the end. So please, as I'm going, as I'm presenting, please do post in the chat, post in the Q&A. That would be great if we could do that. The second thing I want to mention is this webinar is entitled Leading Through Conflict in a Multi-Generational Workplace. After I made the title, I realized that might be a little bit confusing and maybe a little bit misleading. The approach that I'm going to take today is not leading using conflict to resolve issues. It's more about how to lead to resolve conflict in a multi-generational workplace. So it's not trying to say that we're going to, as a leader, insert conflict in our workplaces to try and be an effective leader. It's more about we're in a workplace, a multi-generational workplace which assumedly has some conflict in it. And so we want to work our way through that. So as I was preparing for this session today, I realized that's a little bit of a misleading title. So I wanted to clarify that just a bit. Well, that said, here is what I thought we could do today. This looks kind of lengthy, but it's actually not really overly. It's not that long, I should say. I suspect. I want to talk about some generational trends, and then I want to, unpack that a little bit. Talk about some issues specifically related to those trends. A lot of those issues are going to be tied fundamentally to leadership, followership, and mentorship in multi-generational organizations. And with that, anytime we talk about generations, there are stereotypes that emerge that influence intergenerational interaction. So I want to talk a little bit about that as well, and how those things bring about intergenerational conflict. Now, beyond that, a lot of my research is not just about conflict, but how to resolve conflict. And so after we talk about resolving conflict, the next step then is, okay, once we've created an organization, a culture perhaps, where we've minimized conflict. Now, what do we do? What are the next steps? How do we facilitate positive leadership? How do we facilitate positive followership? How do we facilitate positive mentorship? And so I have some recommendations and some thoughts on each of those three areas as well. And then lastly, all of these things are fundamentally related to learning. And so tying this together by discussing how organizations can learn and how people within organizations can learn from each other. So if that sounds okay with everybody, that's the approach that I'm planning on taking today. So why don't we just dig right in? In 2020, seems like a while ago, but that was really only a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, Deloitte published their Global Human Capital Trends Report. It was a survey, a pretty large survey. And in the survey, 70% of organizational leaders that they responded suggested that individuals from a variety of different generations needed to work well together. In order for our organizations to survive, in order for our organizations to thrive, we need to facilitate people of different ages to work well together. That makes sense. I don't think anyone's really surprised by that. But the interesting thing is only 6% of the respondees, the organizational leaders, said that they are able and ready and actually doing this, facilitating effective intergenerational collaboration. That's kind of interesting. 70% say we need to do it to ensure a good future. 6% say we're actually doing it well. There's a gap there. That's not good. Interesting, but not good. Some work from some researchers that recently published a book by the title of Gentelligence just a couple of months ago suggested that generational labels are leading or causes of stereotypes in the workplace. And that people that are in the workplace rely heavily on those labels, on those stereotypes when they interact with others. I don't think that's too surprising to any of us, but I do think that it has very detrimental effects to our organizations. And so things we need to think about, and we'll talk more about in a couple of seconds here. In 2019, in an article from HR Future magazine, suggested that younger generations are not being properly prepared for leadership roles. But, and this again is in 2019, so 2.5 years ago, they're going to be thrust into such roles pretty soon. Well, actually, we're seeing that now, I think. We're seeing that emergence of younger generations into some more decision-oriented roles, at least more so than we did pre-COVID. And part of that, I think, is due to turnover. Part of that, I think, is due to worker shortages and jobs that are open that do require more leadership skills. Guess what? Individuals may not be prepared well for those roles, especially individuals of younger generations. And so this, in the 2.5 years since that article has been published, as I see it, that gap has been even bigger in terms of the need that we have for younger generations to have leadership skills, but then the gap that they've not perhaps been properly trained to take on some decision-oriented leadership roles. Taken together, what does this all mean? And these are just a few threads. These are just a couple of threads that relate to some trends that are out there that I want to share with you that are, I think, indicative of broader phenomena. What do these things mean, though? Well, my read is that individuals from multiple generations may not be interacting enough in a positive manner all the time so that we're able to achieve top organizational performance now. We saw that in the Deloitte survey. Okay, so that's one thing. It's one takeaway. The second takeaway, though, is that stereotypes and biases drive negative interactions in the workplace. So in other words, why aren't they interacting well enough in a positive manner? Because there's stereotypes, biases that are influencing our perspectives of individuals of certain generations. And that's hurting our current performance. Okay. Now that said, if you take a look at that article from the HR magazine, not only is current performance suffering, but if we think this is going to get better on its own in the future, we're mistaken. Future performance will also suffer because younger generations aren't being developed enough. They're not getting that transfer of knowledge, that transfer of skills to take on leadership, decision-oriented roles. We need more intergenerational knowledge transfer to occur. Okay. Well, if you look at all three of these takeaways, or at least my read of these takeaways, and you know, I'm just one person, of course, but I've been studying generational phenomena for about 15 years. I'm going to share some of my own personal research in today's session too. Taken together, this brings us to the need to understand the importance of how to lead, how to follow, and how to mentor. And one of the things we'll explore here today is that it's not just a top-down approach. Okay, so it's not just, sometimes we tend to think of an older generation mentoring a younger generation, for example. That's not always the case. It doesn't need to be the case. In fact, we think of models of mutual mentorship. There can be learning that occurs both ways, both younger to older, older to younger, etc. So likewise, leadership is not just for experienced workers, those in more mature generations, and followership is not necessarily just for younger employees. Mutual mentorship is necessary for everybody. Leading, following, mentoring shouldn't be determined by age. It should be determined by need. What does the situation require? Who has the KSAs, the knowledge, skills, abilities, the expertise that is best served as a leader or as a mentor or as a follower in particular contexts or particular situations? As I'm putting these slides together and as I'm thinking about how these three areas are interrelated, we talk a lot, at least in academia, and I think in organizations as well, from my experience of being in corporate for a couple of years prior to joining academia, is that we talk a lot about leadership and mentorship. We don't talk enough about followership. It's kind of overshadowed. It's not as cool to talk about, but I think it's also equally as important as those two things. How to be a good follower, how to take a step back and understand that my role in this context is not to take charge and be a leader, but to support, to follow. And inherent with all these things is the idea of learning. Learning has to be ongoing. We need to transfer that knowledge between older to younger and between younger to older so that we can continue not just to function well now, but into the future. And so learning needs to be ongoing through our leadership, our followership, and our mentorship processes. But I want to tackle, I think, what the Gentelligence book and the Deloitte survey are really pinpointing before we get more in depth in leadership, followership, and mentorship. And that is the prevalence of stereotypes in intergenerational interactions. And again, I can't see anybody right now and I can't hear anybody, but if we were to have a discussion about how you would describe certain generations, or maybe a better way to ask this or to talk about this would be, what stereotypes are you most familiar with regarding generations? You would probably be able to come up with several that you've heard of. Well, millennials or the even younger generation Z, they're entitled. Baby boomers don't like change. Now, these descriptors, first of all, they're kind of negative in nature. Second of all, they're setting us up for expectations that won't be overly positive in interactions with those generations. And three, in my mind, they're not really that helpful. Because they set expectations, if I'm interacting with somebody younger or older and I have a negative bias towards that age group, I'm not going to go into that communication with an open mind. I'm not going to focus on that person as an individual. Likely, I might see a stereotype of what I think that generation is about. And I think that's an unproductive way to go about things, especially taken together with the statement that I'm going to make, that as many of the generational stereotypes that we witness in popular media and blogs and articles actually aren't really supported academically. So academic research has not really supported some of those stereotypes, some of the things that we think we know about generations in the workplace. In fact, in my view, the academy research should help support what is going on in organizations, should help provide some insight in what's going on in organizations. Unfortunately, about 20 years ago is really when in-depth research on generations in the workplace actually started to emerge. And some of it kind of conflicts or contradicts what we think we know about generations in popular media and popular society. But that said, whether or not there are clear generational differences or stereotypes, if they're measurable or not, to me, in some instances, that doesn't really matter. Some people always say to me, well, Mike, what are generational differences? Tell me about them. What are they? And in those interviews that I have with I've done a couple of webinars and podcasts about this, and I'll say, I'm not sure what true generational differences are measurable, one, but two, I actually don't really care. And people, as a generational researcher, people ask me, how can you not care about generational differences if you call yourself a generational researcher who has multiple books and articles on this topic that are published? It doesn't matter to me because of this. People perceive that there are differences. And so there are some biases that exist, and people bring those with them to work. Okay. How those perceptions are actualized is what I care about. Whether or not there are true differences doesn't matter. People perceive and believe that there are differences. They bring them to work and they flavor the interactions that we have. Okay. What I care more about then is this last point on this slide. People think that there are differences, whether or not they're measurable, whether or not. But they lead to challenges and they lead to conflict. I know this from my research. I've heard this time and time again of stories about intergenerational conflict, intergenerational tensions that exist in organizations. What I care about is resolving those things. What are some strategies that we could use to actually make this better? What are some strategies so that we're not having problems interacting with each other in the workplace, so that we can function better, not just now, but into the future? And that's really my main concern. So a lot of my early research was really on this, and a lot of my presentations, a lot of my consulting has really been on intergenerational conflict in the workplace. I mentioned before, this will be my fourth time, I think, presenting at ISM's national conference. But all of my other three presentations were really on this topic as well over the past decade or so. What are some perceptions that people have that causes intergenerational conflict or intergenerational tension? Again, whenever I say conflict, it doesn't need to be this overt, in your face conflict where people are yelling or screaming at each other. It could just be more behind the scenes, kind of more tension, maybe even just a slight distrust or an uncomfortableness with somebody from a different generation. Why do these things exist? Before we can get to strategies to resolve them, we have to understand why some of these things might exist. Well, one is that there is a perception that different generations might have different values. Again, whether or not measurable, whether or not true, so to speak, people perceive this to be a challenge. There is a perception, for example, that younger generations have more progressive ideals, whereas older generations have more traditional or conservative ideals. And that creates some tension in the workplace, so that when someone who's older or younger tries to interact or work with somebody from a different generation, there's already that perspective that they're going to care about different things. They're going to have different ideals, and that may mean different goals or different ways of doing work that could set up expectations and biases in how we interact with that individual. The second is based on behavior. So not so much on what people care about, but what people actually do. There is a perception, for example, that younger generations act in an entitled way. I want this now. I don't want to wait for this. I want a raise, a promotion now, and I'm going to do whatever I can to get that. There's also that perception of technology usage. And that's probably one of the things that I hear time and time again in my research, that younger generations rely a lot on technology, maybe older generations not so much. Again, that's a perception. Communication ability. I hear this a lot too. There's a difference in how we communicate across generations, and that could be in the method that we use, whether it's face-to-face, phone, Zoom, text, email, or it could be the topics that we communicate, or it could even be the language that we use, the style of communication, the actual words that we say that might have different meaning from one generation to another. Again, perceptions and differences in how generations communicate. That last reason or cause for intergenerational tension is labeled identity-based. And what I mean by that is how people define themselves or define others. There's been a lot of talk that different generations may be more team-focused as opposed to more focused on the individual. What's in it for me as a person, as an individual? There are also perceived differences between generations in terms of the number of identities or roles that that person might have. I've talked to some folks that suggest that, well, you know, an older person might define themselves just by their work alone, whereas a younger person might have more extracurricular roles outside of work that they might use to define themselves rather than just by their job. Again, I'm not saying that any of these things are clear differences or are measurable, but in discussions that I've had with individuals, and I've done about 100 interviews asking people what causes some age-based tension in your organization. These are things that I've identified as perceptions that cause those tensions. So again, I want to ask that question: are these clear differences, or are these merely perceptions that might be trends that people have? That's not enough. We could stop here, but this isn't enough to stop when we think about generational issues at work. We need to think about, if these are things causing tensions, how do we resolve these tensions? How do we resolve these conflicts? And so in my interviews, I've asked people, what do you do? What strategies do you use to try and resolve whatever tensions or conflicts you might experience? And they came into three broad categories, really: achievement-oriented strategies, image-oriented strategies, and ego-oriented strategies. With achievement-oriented strategies, this is about, again, doing something. So I'm going to try and resolve these tensions by showing, in essence, my worth, by trying to achieve something for the organization, things that perhaps the entire organization cares about, regardless of an individual's age. And so how am I going to do this? Well, I'm going to change my approach to communicating. I'm going to communicate in a manner I think that would be better received by the other party, or I'll just performing proficiently. I'm going to do my job. I'm going to do this job the best I can. I'm going to get some results. And those were two specific ways that people highlighted how they could achieve things in organizations. Now, image-oriented strategies, this is about how others see you. One approach that interviewees talked to me about was being visible. Being visible, just showing that you're there. Now, it was more difficult to do, I think, as work became more online over the past several months. But this is a strategy I think that may continue to grow over the next couple of weeks or months as things open back up and people return back to their facilities to work. Being there, making FaceTime, showing people that you're putting in the hours is one way to build trust between generations. The other is managing information to control age. Sharing things about your age that might be positive. You know, if for example, a younger person might see a need on a team to be good with technology, emphasizing that aspect of self. This could even be changing appearance or changing the way that somebody dresses. Earlier in my career, I used to be clean shaven. Academia tends to be sort of an older type of a career. So I always joke that I grew a beard, as scrappy and as scraggly as it sometimes is. I grew a beard to try and fit in more in academia whenever I was younger, because that's in essence changing appearance, managing information to control image, to try and fit better with colleagues that may have been of a different generation than myself. The third bucket is ego-oriented strategies, and these include things like protecting self-interests. Okay, so I'm going to try and get the goals that I care about accomplished at all costs, regardless of the person I'm communicating with's generation. But the second one there, removing self, this is really interesting. And I heard this from a number of individuals. If I perceive that I'm so different from somebody from another generation that I can't interact with them, at least that's my perception, I'm going to leave that interaction, or I'm going to avoid that interaction. This is really problematic when you have a differential in terms of power in an organization. So let's say there's a manager of one generation and somebody that's that person's direct report of another generation. If that manager perceives that they can't interact with that other generation and they leave, that's not a good relationship. That's not a good managerial relationship. There's not a whole lot of productivity that's going to happen in that group. And so that's very problematic in that type of a situation. But yet these are strategies that individuals suggested to me that they use to try and resolve some of that tension. And by the way, I'm going to have my contact information at the end of the presentation. And so this particular content was published by me in an article, I guess it was around 2017. I'd be happy to send that out to you. Just send me an email and I'd be happy to send out some material on any of my firsthand research on this topic. Now, this is what people can do generally. You know, these are strategies that people can enact and engage in very generally in terms of improving intergenerational communication and tensions. But let's talk more specifically about leadership and followership and mentorship. what are some things we need to think about with regard to leadership and generational issues that may exist in the workplace? There are a lot of definitions for what a leader is and what leadership is, but I'll share with you this. One of my favorites is that leaders influence their organizations. Simple. Leaders are influencers. Doesn't matter what job title you are, if you influence others, that makes you a leader in your organization. And so one of my favorite theories of leadership is related to the basis of power. It's an older theory from actually the late 50s, but it says to be influential, you need some base of power. Actually, if you have multiple bases of power, that makes you more influential. But those are legitimate, reward, coercive, expert, and referent. Legitimate means you're influential because you have a job title. People report you on the org chart. Reward and coercive oftentimes go along with that. Reward power means you can provide people with things that they want, incentives. Coercive power means you can take things away or punish people, in essence. And as a result of reward or coercive power, people are influential. They want things from you, and they don't want you to take things from them, in essence. Expert and referent power are a little bit different. Expert power is that people look up to you and they seek your advice and your knowledge because you're good in what you do. You're maybe the top in your field. People rely on you. And so this person's influential for a couple of reasons. They're training others, they're passing on knowledge, but we want to keep that person happy because if they leave and they haven't transferred that knowledge yet, our organizations won't be able to function well into the future. And lastly, referent power. You're influential because people like you. That's sort of an emotional reaction that people have. And so as a result of that, people want to be around you. That's one, I think, important theory that relates to generational phenomena in the workplace. And I'll share with you on the next slide how these things all relate to different generations. So bear with me for a second. Leader-member exchange is another one. This simply says that effective leadership is marked by trust, open communication, and positive relationships. Makes sense. Makes sense. Those seem to be characteristic of good leader-follower relationships, right? The third is servant leadership. First discussed by Greenleaf in 1977. This perspective on leadership suggests that a leader has a responsibility to serve not just their own team, not just even their own organization, but perhaps society as a whole by developing others, by influencing their workplace to contribute to a collective common good. In other words, to make the world a better place. That's the role of a servant leader. You take this all together, successful leaders develop others. They influence an organization in a positive manner. Now, how does this relate to some of the generational stuff that we're focusing on today? Well, for established generations, for more mature generations, the more bases of power you have, that means the more influence you have on others. Sometimes there is this perspective that arises, and I've heard this from my discussions with individuals from a younger generation, is that, well, my boss just tells me, do what I say because I'm the boss. That's not always going to be an effective approach to motivating everybody, particularly of a generationally diverse group in an organization. So rather than focusing just on that legitimate power, in other words, that power derived only from your job title, leverage some of the other powers as well, the other bases, like referent. Show some emotion, be approachable, create a connection with others in the workplace. The second point here is related to leader-member exchange, talking about those positive interactions. Sometimes this happens with regard to individuals of certain generations. Sometimes they emphasize and they have a better rapport with people of their own generation than people that are perhaps older or younger than them. So for those individuals that are more mature, established generations, focus on those younger generations as individuals rather than younger stereotypes. That's going to help you create a better rapport. And so that's going to build that more positive relationship as opposed to just thinking this person is a millennial, this person is Gen Z. So here's their expectation. Get to know that person as an individual instead of focusing on that stereotype or on that bias that might exist. And lastly, in line with servant leadership, emphasize the purpose of the organization, create a positive impact. In a generationally diverse workplace, people are there working for you for a variety of different reasons. Some might be just for a paycheck, of course, but others might want to make a contribution, might want to, believe it or not, change the world. And so to engage those individuals of that generation that might have that mindset, try and show opportunities, try and show ways in which we are improving society, try and show ways in which we are improving the world around us through that person's individual role, and help coach them through that so they can see that. Okay, but for emerging generations, what are some things that they can do with regard to leadership? Well, early in one's career, they might only possess one base of power. They might not perhaps have that legitimate power if they don't have a title of authority. And along with that, then they won't possess reward or coercive power. They might not know a whole lot of people, so they might have a hard time making emotional connections. They might not have that referent power. If they have any power, maybe it's expert because maybe they're just coming straight out of school and they have some type of knowledge that they've learned. But again, it's not hands-on necessarily. It might just be, for lack of a better term, book learning. Well, we have to build emerging professionals. If you only have one base or one base of power, or don't have any bases of power just yet, so you're not influential in your organization, you need to develop more. You need to develop that expert power. You need to get to know people, step outside your comfort zone, meet them, create an emotional connection with them. That way you'll become more influential as you continue to build power. And I don't say that in a way that's meant to be manipulative or something like that. As you build influence, rather, those bases will start to grow in tandem along with each other as you become more develop more expertise, develop those more reference skills. Eventually, perhaps that individual will rise through the hierarchy as well, so that they have legitimate authority. They develop that base of power as well. Just like I mentioned, that second bullet point here, just like I mentioned with the established generation, don't focus on stereotypes. Don't approach that older person that might be your supervisor or might not be, might be your report, even your direct report. Don't think about their expectations in a way that relies solely on the stereotypes you've heard about. Get to know them on an individual level. What makes that person tick as an individual? It's going to be different than what you've heard about in the news or read about in the blog. Every person is a unique individual. Get to know that person. And lastly, in line with servant leadership, emerging professionals, the thought is, and I don't know if this is always the case, but the thought is they're more concerned with meaning at work. So holding their organizations accountable so that they develop others is important to make sure that our organizations are truly adding value to the world and the communities in which they serve. That's important. So hold your organizations accountable as an emerging generation. Okay. Now, followership is also as important, if not even more important than leadership, as we think about generations. Followership is the inverse, but not necessarily the opposite of leadership. It's almost the flip side of the coin. It's not the opposite. It's about supporting leaders. Again, not supporting leaders blindly, not doing whatever they say, but helping them to lead well. It's not just going along with whatever they tell you to do, but it's about having confidence. It's about being able to speak up, to provide guidance to that leader. It's about providing support to that leader as well when they need something. Okay. I like to think of this idea of the leader-follower dance. Okay. Folks that were with me in my last presentation of ISM New Jersey, I mentioned Glenn Miller. Glenn Miller is somebody that I talk a lot about with regard to leadership. And I mentioned Glenn Miller. He's a famous trombone player from the 1930s and 40s. There's a picture of him holding a trombone and a cigarette there. Below that picture is a picture of Tex Beneke. Tex Beneke actually played tenor saxophone and sang in one of Glenn Miller's orchestras. Very famous vocalist. If you're familiar with some of Glenn Miller's songs, he was one of the vocalists in some of those songs that are the most famous. Well, why I'm suggesting this to you is there's a leader-follower dance. Some situations require you to be a leader. Some require you to be a follower. It's important to understand your context. Now, in a previous presentation I made to ISM New Jersey in the fall, I talked about what helped Glenn Miller rise to become an effective leader. And if you recall from that session, for those that you were in that session, if you recall from that session, I mentioned how Glenn Miller disappeared over the English Channel en route to a performance. He was such a good leader, though, that he actually, among his followers and his band, they had a process, they had the foundation that they were able then to perform without him the very next day after he disappeared. Now, years later, what happened? Tex Beneke, tenor player in his band, saxophone player in his band, takes over the reins and leads the Glenn Miller Orchestra for years after Glenn Miller's disappearance. Now, in that case, Glenn Miller literally stepped aside by disappearing, but he mentored Tex Beneke. He provided Tex Beneke with the foundation to take over that orchestra eventually. Now, whether he did that knowingly or unknowingly, there was some mentorship that occurred there. And that allowed Tex Beneke then to take over that leadership role whenever Glenn Miller wasn't there. Sometimes the leader-follower dance is explicit like that, and sometimes it's more day-to-day. Sometimes it's more, there might be a situation that arises at work in which somebody might have the knowledge, skills, and abilities and expertise for. That person, if they have the expertise to lead in that context, should be the leader, should take the reins. Doesn't matter what age they are, could be older, could be younger. That person that does not have that expertise needs to take a step back, regardless of what that person's formal title might be. Focus, in other words, on the KSAs. Stress the knowledge, stress the skills, stress the abilities that help to accomplish mutual goals. It's not about formal authority. It's not about that legitimate base of power. It's about letting that person lead who has the expertise. It's more about the expert base of power. Anybody in an organization can be a leader. Anybody can be a follower, regardless of where you're at in the org chart, regardless of what your age or generation is. So some recommendations then for those established generations. There is a concern sometimes that if a colleague is younger, they're not primed or ready for a leadership role, or not able to be a leader, or there is perhaps sometimes this bit of pride of I don't want to follow someone who's younger than me. We need to help that person to develop, first of all. And sometimes we need to understand that we can take a step back and let that person influence us. Again, it goes back to identify that person with the knowledge, skills, and abilities that can make that positive difference. Well, likewise, for emerging generations, look for ways to develop your leadership skills. As a follower, find a mentor who is a leader so that you can develop your leadership skills to be influential. Take on small assignments, volunteer for committees. Be a follower in that regards, that as you're following, as you're doing these things that are voluntary, you're also perhaps helping yourself to become more emergent. Okay, you're helping yourself to become an emerging leader by taking on some followership roles, by following in the footsteps of those that are leading you. Don't take charge in all situations. There is a frustration sometimes that I've heard where emerging generations will come in and want to take charge on day one. Here's what I want to do. I want to do this. Let me go. Let me try this out. Sit back, learn. That's important. Okay, that's important for the emerging generation too. Learn the wisdom of the people that have been in the organization for a long period of time. Okay, that's important to listen to and to acknowledge so that we understand the context of the decisions that are being made and the context of decisions that you may be making in the future. Mentorship is a big part of this too. Again, it's not necessarily just emerging professionals learning from established professionals. There's mutual mentorship. As Kathy mentioned in the introduction, I edited a series of books on popular culture and leadership. And one of the books that I wrote that came out about a year ago is on leadership in Star Wars. So I have a picture of Rey and Luke Skywalker from the most recent Star Wars trilogy. They both learn from each other. Okay, not to get too nerdy, but Rey learned the ways of the Force from Luke. But Luke also, because Rey kind of pushed him a little bit, he was kind of this recluse. He was kind of more of a hermit, removed from the goings-ons of the galaxy. Rey kind of pushed him to get back involved again. They learned from each other. They developed each other for the betterment of the galaxy around them. Now, in a real world pop culture example, I love the movie The Intern. I'm not sure if anyone here has ever seen that movie with Robert De Niro and Anne Hathaway. Excellent movie. I highly recommend. But it really shows a beautiful relationship of mutual mentorship. Anne Hathaway is a CEO of her organization. Robert De Niro is actually the intern in that organization, but he has a lot of industry experience prior to being in that role. He's retired from that role, but both learn from each other. And I think both movies, The Intern and Star Wars, show a way in which mutual mentorship can occur. It's not just top down, established learning or established teaching emerging professionals. It can be both ways. Some of the best mentorship is informal, where people learn from each other. Also, we also want to remember what the outcomes of mentorship are. It's not just about learning how to do a job. It's also about interpersonal mentorship. It's about learning how to cope with a job, learning about the emotions that someone experiences while they're on a job. Mentorship is crucial to current leaders, but also to developing leaders as well. So for those established generations, I've heard from some emerging professionals that, I feel like I'm getting lectured at. Whenever someone wants to tell me something that's been in an organization for a while, they lecture me. Try not being the sage on the stage. Be open to what you can learn from emerging professionals. As we teach, make it more of a dialogue. Make it more an open discussion. Seek out actively a mentee or a mentor that fits you. Maybe someone that you see someone of yourself in, someone that you feel like, I've been in that person's career. I've been in that person's shoes before. The challenge is this. As we're doing that, be careful not to just seek out people that look like you or that think like you or that act like you. Think about someone that's different from you as well. Maybe someone that is at a similar level of their career that you used to be, but also someone that perhaps, I don't know, is of a different gender, of a different religion, a different faith, a different ethnicity or race. Think about someone that is different than you as well as you choose that person to mentor. Don't forget to introduce that mentee to your extended professional network. It's not all about learning the job. That's part of it. It's part learning how to cope with emotions on the job, but it's also about growing that person's network so that they can be successful. Introduce that person to other people. And with emerging generations, established professionals can get as much from you as you can get from them. So understand that in a mentoring relationship, it's a two-way street. Be active, engage with that person, work with that person so that hopefully they're learning from you too. You should actively also seek out a mentor. Think of a person that has the skills that you want or is in a role that you want to grow into. Find that person, ask that person to be your mentor, follow that person around. And don't forget that person can be a good listener for you to express your emotions. One of my personal mentors, yeah, she taught me a lot about the role I'm in now, about my job, but she also listened to me vent as I was having a good day, or she also helped me to celebrate whenever I was having a good day. Why? Because she was there. She was in that role before, and she helped me to do that. And she helped me to experience those emotions. And also she introduced me to colleagues of mine that now are important to my career. She opened her network, in other words. I think that's very important to expect and to ask from a mentor as well. Mentorship is about learning, of course. Followership, as I mentioned, is about learning from a leader. Leadership is about facilitating learning. So all of this relates to learning. And as I mentioned, if we're going to continue to grow as an organization, we need to learn. We need to facilitate that knowledge transfer across generations. So when we're leading, when we're following, we're mentoring, the goal is to achieve common goals. We want to improve intergenerational interactions. We want to improve knowledge transfer, meaning learning. And some other research that I worked on with a colleague from Quinnipiac University, there are certain considerations of multi-generational learning that we need to think about. What types of knowledge we want to transfer? And so depending on what type of knowledge we want to transfer, how do we do that? What's the best format for it? Is it through classroom training, through mentoring, through coaching, through some type of creating a game to help influence or instruct, or something else? But also providing non-traditional experiences like volunteering in low-stakes decision-making. Volunteering within the community can teach us a whole lot that we can bring as skills to learn in a multi-generational organization. So to facilitate that intergenerational knowledge transfer, we need to always ask ourselves what works best in your context. I just have to do one little plug here before I conclude today. Some of what I talked about is actually coming out in a book that is coming out in July, publishing, called Leadership in Multi-Generational Organizations. It's through Emerald Publishing. And that book, I just finished actually looking at the proofs earlier today, and I just approved them. So I'm expecting that book to be on time in July. I think it may be available for pre-order on Amazon, some other sellers right now already, but it is something that's forthcoming and something that if you want to check it out, it is available to you. But I'm also happy if you want to send me an email or get in touch with me in some way, please do send me an email. I'd be happy to send you some of my other articles that are more open access. I can send those to you without you having to take a look at that book too. So I'd be happy to send those and share some of my research with you that way. That said, wow, I blew through that time. That was quick. I guess it's time for questions, comments, discussions. If we can, I guess, transition to that.
Oh, definitely. We do have one question for you. Plus, I'm glad you mentioned the book because I was going to ask you about that anyway. So thanks for sharing that with everybody, because I did see that out on LinkedIn through a message. We did have one question that came in. Do you find that multi-generational labeling is more a result of social media or media or an organic phenomenon?
Well, it's both. It really is both. I didn't talk about it here in one of the articles that I published. I explored this more about where labeling comes from. Uh, so I think that was going through the chat. It looked like it was James that asked the question. I think James, if you want to send me an email, I can send you an article where I go into a little bit more about where some of these labels come from and some of the stereotypes come from. But it comes from two things. They come from two things that I found in my research. One, from media, from society around us. What labels are we exposed to? But also it comes to what is our experience with interacting with other generations. And so maybe that's not so much on the label side, but maybe that is on the stereotyping side. Everybody, regardless of what label they attributed to certain generations, almost everybody that I've talked to through my research made a dichotomous distinction between young and old, for better or worse. And some people would say, well, I've had really great experience working with somebody older than me at work or with somebody younger than me with work. And so to them, the stereotypes of the biases weren't as prevalent or even existed at all, because they had good positive experiences in the past. And so they were able to translate that to others. Now, other individuals I've spoken with have said the opposite. Oh, well, I had a hard time interacting with this younger person or this older person in the past. And so all young people or all old people must be like that. So it is a function of both media and social media, but I think it's also organic in the sense that it's happening real time in our individual interactions that we have in our organizations. And those aren't separate from each other. So when we have either a positive or negative experience in an organization, we then take that experience and learn from it and then transfer that to future experiences as well. We kind of portray somebody that might be of a particular generation we've already had experience with. We kind of just, do a broad swipe, a broad stroke. And we then think, okay, well, because I interacted well or poorly with this person from another generation in the past, that means whenever I interact with somebody else from that generation in the future, it will be the same. So I hope that answered your question, James.
Okay, thank you so much. Another question just came in. Are these same stereotypes and solutions appropriate directly working to increase supplier diversity in supply chain?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. When we think about supplier diversity and we think about diversity in general, a lot of my personal research is on age diversity and generational diversity. But as I look through these strategies and as I look through these types of conflict, sometimes I wonder to myself, is this just age-based? Are these just age-based tensions? Or are these just age influence strategies that can improve our interactions? Or are they more general than that? Are they related to any conflict that we might see or any potential perceived differences that we might see? So much so that I teach a course in the grad program that I direct called Communication, Conflict, and Diversity. And we talk a lot about some of my findings from my research on generations in that class. And we do have a discussion almost every time I offer the course on, does this relate to pretty much other areas of conflict that we might experience as well? And students in the class seem to say, yeah, I mean, I could see these strategies to facilitate better interactions work in other types of conflict that I'm experiencing that might not just be age-based. Now, in the research that I've did, I explicitly asked the people that I was talking with about age. And so that's why we're labeling these in today's session as really age-focused or generational focused. But it could be that these could help with other types of diversity as well. And so as we think about supplier diversity and broadening, the types of diversity that we're thinking about, certainly, Robert, I think that these solutions could be appropriate for working with increasing supplier diversity. So, Robert, I hope that answered your question as well.
Okay, thank you. Another question just came in. In my organization, it is more a selfish motive in regards to transfer of knowledge. The basic response being, I had to learn it myself. The next person will have to do that too. It doesn't matter their age. This seems to be the all about me thing and not the team. How is that able to be worked around?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When we think about age and we think about statements such as that, and I think that's Chip that asked that question, right, Chip?
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
Chip, sometimes it's hard to separate those things. Sometimes, but not always, but sometimes age and experience go hand in hand. And so even though at the surface it might not seem about age, sometimes it is implicitly or behind the scenes a little bit about age. Um, Now, that said, it goes back to one of my earlier slides, and that is the survival of the organization, the ability to function. If we're not able to transfer knowledge, if we're not able to have these good interactions, we're going to have decreased functionality now, and we're certainly going to have decreased functionality into the future. So if those individuals who have been in the organization for a while and perhaps make statements such as this, have a care or have a concern for the direction of the organization into the future, even after they leave, they should be focused on this stuff. They should care about knowledge transfer. Likewise, if they're worried about perhaps, and I think everyone should be right now, about their own industries and their own jobs, uh, why would we not want to have a good positive culture where people can learn from each other? If that means if we're all in this together, that means we're working well. That means job security for everybody. That means that we're able to create a good positive culture where everybody wants to work together. And so that's only a positive. Now, to try and create that mindset really needs to happen at the individual level, yes, but also the organizational level. And that goes to a cultural issue of the organization having a mentality of an us versus them type of a culture. It doesn't need to be that way. We need to find some way to create common ground and create this overarching goal or way of thinking that says it's not about, people have to pay their dues to learn something. It's about if we're going to function well, we got to work together. And creating that mindset can be difficult. But I think, Chip, to kind of resolve what you're talking about, that needs to be done. Beyond that, I don't have any clear recommendations that will work in every single situation because there isn't. We have to understand our own context. We have to understand our own culture to be able to work through that so we can get people's light bulbs turned on to say, oh yeah, we're all in this together. It's not about what I know versus what you know, but it's about together collaboratively, what we can know together to continue to function.
Okay, thank you. Another question came in. Which leadership style is generally more acceptable for organizations?
Again, it depends on context. What leadership style will work in all contexts? There really isn't one. Sometimes we think, oh, transformational sounds great, right? Transformational leadership sounds perfect. Yeah, but there are in some instances, some contexts where people are there just for a paycheck. There are those leaders that try and create a good, positive work environment and culture, and that is usually a good thing. Yeah, but keep in mind that if that's not what your employees want, if they just want to show up to work, get the job done, and leave, that's not going to really motivate them. So there's not one best approach for leadership in all contexts. I would say there are some that are better than others in most contexts. You, as a leader, you have to understand your people. You have to understand your culture. You have to understand the goals of your organization to understand what leadership approach is truly going to work best. And so it's not a one size fits all saying this is the best leadership approach for every organization. It's more about fitting that context.
Okay, we have one last question because we're almost out of time.
Okay.
As a consultant, I have found that some management in a younger generation had ego issues where they find it difficult to learn more from a more seasoned professional. They either try to force you do it their way, we always do it, which was not what their management wanted to take. Hold on a second, which was not their management wanted to take your work and present it as their own. And then they are not able to explain it in their presentation. How do you suggest that be mitigated?
Yeah. I've heard this in many of the individuals that I spoke with as well, is that there's a perception. Sometimes that perception of ego is from an older perceiving a younger individual having an ego, and that, well, they don't want to listen to me and they don't want to learn, so they just want to do it their way quickly. Sometimes it's the other way around too, where someone from another younger generation says, well, I feel like I can't do anything because no matter what I try and do, this older person's either going to, do it the way they're used to doing it, or maybe, I think this is what you're kind of getting at, if I'm not mistaken, Robin, is that maybe they might even take credit for that work. Either situation is not good. Again, I'm a big believer in, let's focus less on the role. Let's focus less on, who made the breakthrough, who came up with the idea, but can the team work collaboratively toward this end? Can the team work together? And so it's all about collaboration. It's all about teamwork. Again, that's it's easy for me as sitting far away from your organization where that's happened to say that, because it's easier said than done in an organization that is not collaborative in nature, but it's something that we need to work towards. It's something that we need to discuss and say, an us versus them mentality doesn't benefit anyone. We're in this together. If we're going to continue to function, if we're going to continue to survive, we need to collaborate.
Okay, thank you. We just had one comment from Michael. He just said he agreed with what your response about the leadership style as well.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. At this point, we're actually out of time. I can't believe it. It's we have like 1 minute left, but
that was fast.
Out of time. I know it really went fast today. Thank you so much for bringing this content to our group here. And I want to thank all of our attendees for participating in today's program and all your questions. And at this point, I'm going to close out the program, say thank you for attending. And I will send Michael's contact information. So if you have any follow-up questions, you can email him directly. Okay.
All right. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.